Greetings, comrades! It's a lazy Sunday. Why not take your pants off, relax, and play some chess? Back examining isolated pawns. We've looked at strategies to take the isolated pawn into an endgame, into a bit more reduced material. Next, we're going to look at more defensive techniques, because in all the examples we've looked at, the person with the isolated pawn has been a little bit cooperative. They've been sort of ideal examples of where the isolated pawn doesn't play aggressively enough or allows too many pieces to come off the board. We're going to start looking at a couple of examples where the isolated pawn does some things more correctly, and where the side going against the isolated pawn actually has to defend a little bit and actually has to play accurately to survive. So defending is difficult. It is probably the hardest task to perform in chess, practically because it's hard to defend just generally. It's hard to find good defensive moves. Finding attacking moves is a lot easier, just because it's psychologically easier to be on the aggressive rather than the defensive. So being able to be a good defender really is a rare skill. So we're going to learn a couple of defensive techniques against the typical isolated pawn attacking setups. So this is Max Euwe against Euwe-Najdorf from the Wertheim Memorial in New York, 1951. So Euwe went d4, d5. And we get a standard Queen's Gambit accepted. And then a6. This is the modern improved method. Black threatens a queenside expansion with b5. Euwe plays Queen e2, which it's not a bad move, but it's not really the main modern move. a4, that's another pure invention of Akiba Rubinstein's. That is a real trade-off. So that stops the expansion with b5, but it creates a weakness on b4 that black can occupy with his knight after knight c6 and knight b4. It's a true trade-off. I don't think it's better or worse than the other lines, it's just different. I personally don't mind it as white, but you do create that weakness on b4, so it is a true trade-off. The modern approved method, I would say, it scores the best, and it might be overall the most accurate if you try to keep track of that, is bishop b3. So the bishop drops back from the b5 attack before it happens. So on b5, white can immediately play a4. And he tries to take advantage of the b5 pawn and tries to prove that it's a weakness. I think objectively, this position is fine for black, but white scores incredibly well for this position. So that probably means something. But Queen e2 is played in the game, just an older way of playing. 64, this is not accurate. So this is a good example of a poor transition. Whenever you're thinking of when to transition to an isolated pawn, keep an eye on that dark square bishop. It hasn't moved yet, so getting it developed for white wouldn't cost any tempi. There's not a knight on d2 obstructing it, and black doesn't have any of the squares on that diagonal obstructed either. So when black takes on d4, it's just giving white pure free development. It's freeing that dark square bishop's development for no cost for white. b5 is the modern main line, and we see that's actually takes a little bit of advantage of Queen e2. This is perfectly equal for black. But taking on d4 definitely is a little bit more comfortable for white. Ex d4, rook d1 is another way of doing things, and that's fairly common, but it basically just transposes in the game. Bishop e7, rook d1, I probably wouldn't have played this way. When in the opening you're trying to decide between two different moves, ask yourself which of the moves is most necessary. So in this position, I can imagine some positions where the rook doesn't belong in d1. I can't imagine any positions where the knight doesn't belong in c3. So logically, that would lead me to play knight c3 first. So I personally would play knight c3 and then bishop g5 first, because I know those moves are basically more or less guaranteed to be correct. And then after that, white can sort of decide what to play based on black's responses to those moves. So rook d1 is not necessarily bad, just potentially locks white into something that may or may not be optimal. Put it like that. So b5, standard expansion. Bishop e7, the bishop looks very nice in that diagonal. Whenever black is able to get that light square bishop solved in these isolated queen pawn setups, that is a huge boon for him. I would say black is doing perfectly fine here. a4, I'm not super fond of this. It is somewhat thematic against b5, but it doesn't necessarily achieve anything here. So it forces b4, but that takes the c3 square away from white's knight, which is a good thing. for black. He wants to prevent white from having that square for his knight. For white, I would probably just play knight c3, and then just finishing development. And this is a normal isolate queen pawn battle. There's plenty to play for after this. So a4, not my favorite. b4, knight bd2, knight c4. So this sort of reminds me of the positions we looked at earlier in this series, where we were looking at how to play with the isolated pawn, when black would have his knight sitting on f6 and d5. The knight looks nice on c4, because both the knights are aiming at that e5 square, that outpost square, but they sort of duplicate one another's efforts. You would much rather have this knight, say, on f4, another piece sort of close to the king side to begin the attack. Whereas on c4, it has some use, especially if you can get some queenside play going. But it's sort of they over-duplicate their efforts in occupying e5. Like, there's no reason to overprotect that point. So you would rather this knight were somewhere else doing something more important. But this is still an equal position. Knight bd7, this is a positional mistake. This gives white a concrete path to an advantage. a5 is the best. That prevents what white could have played. Knight fe5, that's incorrect. Doesn't take advantage of the opportunity. Whenever you played a4, you sort of lock yourself into, at the very least, thinking about some queenside plans. So a5 would be best here. That takes away black being able to play a5 to help solidify the b4 pawn, and it gives him b6 a potential outpost square for his knight. So that's completely correct. White would have a small but very real advantage here. The b4 pawn could very well get weak in some positions. And then the knight on d7 has to stay there to babysit that outpost square in b6. So white has a very nice position here. But knight fe5, that gives black an opportunity to play a5, so now we're back to pretty much balance. Rook d3. So this is a good example. We looked at rook lifts where it's advantageous for the isolated pawn. This is a good example of where the rook lift doesn't necessarily really achieve anything. White still has a lot of mobilization left to do. So he has his bishop on c1 and his rook on a1 still asleep. That makes any kingside attack less likely to succeed. He's got his knight on c4. That's another piece that's away from the potential kingside attack. So he's got three pieces that are sort of out of the game in terms of the attack. The bishop doesn't really have direct access to the kingside right now. If this knight moves away, it would. But that's another piece that's at least temporarily blocked out of the fight. So rook d3 is standard in terms of ideas, but there's a lot less material supporting it than otherwise, so it makes it less likely that this rook lift is going to be successful. I personally would have finished mobilization first with bishop d5, and then maybe rook d3 would be more appropriate in some other position. But rook d3, knight b6, this is proper technique. When you're going against the isolated pawn, especially when that kingside attack starts brewing, look to trade off minor pieces. If black can get off one or two sets of minor pieces, that rook lift seems a lot less threatening. So, rook g3, this is a flat-out error. I give a long line. I don't want to make the video too long, but knight xb6 is correct. And then rook g3 here. Mostly just because that's the way the tactics work. The main line that I give is knight e4, rook e3, and then the very nice knight xf7. And then the rook's just going to recapture on e7. White's going to regain his piece with a material edge and a continuing initiative. So this is a crushing position. The correct move after rook g3 would be king h8, getting off both the g file and this diagonal, which two very nasty positions. So the king just shifts right out of it. This is still fairly equal, but this is definitely a lot more dangerous position for black. Whereas after rook g3, black has a direct way to eliminate a lot of stuff. Knight takes, so the bishop takes back because he doesn't want to take the knight away from the theater, and then knight e4. So this is excellent defensive technique, and this is where I wanted to start talking about typical ways to defuse an isolate queen pawn attack. Whenever you can, whenever you're possible, when you're defending, defend actively. Passive defense almost never works. If you just sort of sit back and try to be a solid rock, you're going to get blown up eventually because you're not slowing your opponent down. Your opponent has time to build up optimally and get all of his pieces involved. When you're defending, you want to create counter threats. The easiest way to defend is to derail the attack by creating counterplay, because then you never have to defend at all. So knight e4, it starts to derail the attack, because instead of another build-up move, white has to respond to his rook being attacked, and that gives black time to mobilize or create more threats. Rook g4, this is incorrect. Rook d3 was best. He has to defend the d4 pawn, but after knight d6, this is a very nice position for black. This is exactly what you want to get against the isolated pawn, because ultimately, the square black wants to go to in a lot of positions with his knight is f5, because it helps defend his kingside and attacks the weak opponent d4. So whenever black can get his knight to that strong square, he's typically doing quite well for both defensive and offensive purposes. So after rook g4, knight d6 still attacks the light square bishop and threatens to hop to f5. This is very, very nice. Bishop e3, bishop f6. So this is another common defensive move against the isolated pawn. That bishop shifts to f6 to help shore up that weak g7 point. And notice that black hasn't moved any of his kingside pawns yet. That is excellent defensive technique in general. Pawns can't move backwards. This is sort of a banality that Tigran Petrosian was fond of observing. But you need to think of that, remember that every time you think of moving a pawn. You can move your knight backwards from a bad position. You can move your queen back, and it just costs you some time. A pawn move can't be taken back, and pawns sort of determine the whole structure of a chess game. So when you play a pawn move, that's permanently changing the terrain of the game. So you need to be very careful with your pawn moves, especially when defending. Any pawn move in front of the king side when you're defending is a potential weakness. We've talked about with the previous rook lift games that playing the pawn to h6 is often a sort of a red flag for that rook lift, a sort of mnemonic device for the rook lift working better. Because h6 is a weakness and then g7 is a weakness. Here, black is just leaving all of his pawns in place for as long as he can and just defending with as few pieces he can and creating counter threats. So the bishop shores up the g7 square, and the knight's going to come to f5 for attack. So excellent technique from Najdorf. Rook f4, rook c8. He doesn't forget to mobilize. That's not a terribly bad move. Knight f4 is a little bit more accurate just because it goes straight for that weak d4 pawn. But you can never be too mad about mobilizing your pieces. That's a perfectly fine move. Bishop e3, rook e8. So this is definitely a drift. This move doesn't really have a point. And it also weakens the f7 square, so in some variations, it is a huge loss for black. Knight f5, that is the move that you want to build towards in a lot of these positions, because it attacks that weak d4 pawn, and the knight also helps shore up the king side, helps block out that rook. So rook e8, definitely a little bit of a drift. Rook d1, very much a drift after bishop d5. This is what you want to play in some positions, but this could lead to symmetry, which really isn't what black wants to go for here. I mean, this is a superior position for black. He wants that isolated pawn on the board. He doesn't want to head for a symmetrical position. It's the wrong time to transition to symmetry. Rook c7 is superior. It helps shore up the f7 point. In some positions, you can play queen a8 and then bishop d5, because then you'd be recapturing on d5 with the queen instead of the pawn. So rook c7 is just a flat-out better move. Bishop d5, bishop c2. This is just incorrect. White should just head for the symmetry. And this is ugly for white, but he still has defensive chances, because material's still even. Black hasn't managed to win anything just yet. And the pawn structure being symmetrical, that always creates drawing chances. So, but bishop c2, white just doesn't have enough attacking firepower to break through on the king side. So g6. So black finally makes a move on the king side, but that g6 move perfectly blocks out everything. It blocks out the light squared bishop, blocks out the knight, and then that bishop on f6 is perfectly placed. It's ready to just drop right back into g7 to help shore up that fianchetto. So this is a great move from black. Black is doing extraordinarily well here. And now he's ready to, once he's made that one defensive move, he's ready to shift back into aggressive mode and take advantage of white's weaknesses. Rook g4, and now finally knight f5. This is the move that he's really wanted to play and should have played previously. But that knight in f5 is a monster. It helps hold up the king side. It's attacking the weak d4 point. Excellent move. Euwe immediately takes on f5. This is a poor choice. Bishop e4 tries to hold serve and keep things as muddy as possible. The game choice, this is an absolute dream position against the IQP. And it's exactly what a position will look like when you've defended properly and white's attack just never materialized. So black's got the 2 bishops. White still has that weak d4 point. That rook on g4 just does not make sense at all. The downside to the rook lift is that if your attack doesn't crash through, that rook is just going to be out there doing nothing. So when black finally counterattacks in the center of the queen side, black is going to be functionally up a rook, because that rook is just completely out of the game. The passed pawn on d4 just really isn't... It's securely blockaded, it can't move. In some ways, white would pay black to make that pawn disappear, just so he'd have more room for his pieces. But this is a technically winning position for black, and black converts pretty accurately. Bishop e3, hitting the rook. f4, so very simple tactics. He's going to get rid of that double pawn, and then with the d4 pawn gone, the stability of the e5 knight disappears. So now all of a sudden, all of white's pieces are hanging. Queen x b2, and then Euwe resigns here. This is just completely gone. Najdorf even took time to take that pawn. He could have taken an e5, but now he's starting to take an e5, and the bishop on b3 isn't hanging. So this is just a completely dominating position, and Euwe finally resigned here. The key to this game was earlier, of course. I can always say that, because it's always true. Really, the key to this game, I think, starts with a4. It takes white away from his typical isolated queen-pawn strategy. So instead of building up for the classic Kingside attack with normal moves, the knight's on c3, the bishop's a little bit strange in f4, but it's actually, I think it's best there for now. But yeah, otherwise everything is just normal. He's just going to build up with normal moves, like a3, bishop c2, queen d3, just normal isolated queen-pawn structure attacking ideas that are perfectly silent for white. He gets to this, and it looks nice, and black does misplay it. Black does give white an opportunity to take advantage of this. But let's get to, after a5, there's just not much for white here. The rook lift doesn't work. Bishop g5 is the best move here. But this attack just never really had a chance, because it didn't have enough pieces supporting it. It didn't have the bishop on c1. It didn't have the rook on a1. Black's able to get a set of minor pieces off the board immediately, and then create counter threats against that rook, because white did spend time putting it out there. This is proper defensive technique from black. This is just an attack that, it looks scary at first, because that rook lift always looks a little bit scary, but black had the proper moves to just sort of blunt it before it really ever got off the ground. So excellent defensive technique from Najdorf, and how he moved to the counteroffensive is very instructional. So, as usual, I have the PGN notes in the comments of the video. Next video, we're just going to continue with the same examination, looking at defensive techniques against the isolated pawn. My name is John. I'll catch you later.